welcome to episode 97 of the Swampflix podcast. My name is Brandon Leday.
And I'm James Cone.
And we are recording in James's apartment in Mid-City, New Orleans. And this is the podcast version of the movie review website Swampflix. Do you want to talk about what happened with episode 96, or do you want to move on?
Man, it's such a bummer.
Yeah.
Because it was such a good conversation, and we haven't had technical issues like that in a while.
Yeah.
And stuff.
It sucks, too, just because Gully Boy is a movie I've been, championing for, months, and then that's the episode that, fell apart.
Yeah, I don't know what happened, dude. I guess the mic was disconnected.
Yeah.
Fuck. It's a bummer.
Well, I did my best to salvage it. Kudos to anyone who managed to listen to that whole thing.
You did a good job, though, for what you had to work with.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know you put in a lot of time and effort.
Way more than I should have.
Yeah.
Well, it's early December right now, so this is best of the year catch-up season. What have you been watching lately in this haze of cramming in list-making material?
Which I did a lot this weekend.
Yeah?
We went and saw Knives Out last night, which was fantastic.
I hear it's a crowd pleaser.
Yeah, and it was nice seeing it in a packed movie theater. I don't know, I've had some bad movie-going experiences when the theater's that packed, especially during horror movies where you have people talking over it and laughing at inappropriate times, but everybody at Britannia was on the same page with this movie, and it made it so much more enjoyable. And I do think it will probably be one of my favorite movies of the year.
Interesting.
It's so much fun.
You got Daniel Craig doing his southern accent from Logan Lucky.
Yeah, it's KFC accent.
Yeah.
But it's that Agatha Christie style murder mystery, but it's actually way more interesting than that. It's thematically rich too, and the dialogue is very funny, and it is a crowd pleaser. It's just a blast. It's probably the most fun I've had in the theater this year. And again, I think the social aspect of seeing it with a bunch of people helped.
Nice.
So that was really good. And then some other stuff I caught up on. I saw Her Smell from this year, which I really loved.
That is not a crowd pleaser.
No, and it was very hard to watch. Elizabeth Moss just burned through that movie. With these downfall of a rock star type movies, it can kind of glamorize the lifestyle a little bit. That doesn't happen in this movie. And I like that she was fearless enough to be annoying too. And for large parts of the movie, she has no redeeming qualities. And I also love the structure of it, where it's very distinct, long 20, 30-minute scenes. I think there's 5 acts.
Yeah, it's kind of like a stage play at some points.
Yeah.
But the camera does move from room to room. It's not that it's not cinematic, but there's long, unbroken bits of dialogue as she's basically a whirlwind backstage, just ruining lives from room to room.
God, it's so brutal and hard to watch. But ultimately, I like where they took the story and the way that it kind of resolves itself. It leaves a lot of open questions about what is her ultimate fate, but I thought it was a really good take on that
addiction story.
Yeah, definitely about addiction and the punk rock scene and just the rock lifestyle in general, and how, again, it's not celebrating the debauchery. It's saying there's ramifications for this, and you hurt the people around you. And again, I think her performance is probably one of my favorite performances of the year.
And it's definitely a particular rock scene that you don't see on screen that much. That,
yeah, it's that L7.
Breeders Sleater-Kinney kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It's a very specific type of rock and roll that I don't normally see in fiction, I don't think. I like that specificity of it.
Me too. And it definitely got some Courtney Love vibes.
Oh, for sure. I think it's intentional. I also want to ask you too, I know you weren't that much of a fan of Queen of Earth, which was Alex Ross Perry and Elizabeth Moss's former collaboration. What do you think is better about this one than that one? Because I thought they were on kind of a similar vibe.
I think a lot of it did have to do with, like you said, the specific kind of time period in the scene that it was talking about. And I'm into that style of music too. So that's kind of what brought me into it as well. And I think ultimately the way the story resolves too, if I remember correctly, Queen of Earth,
that one doesn't really have a clear story.
Yeah.
It's almost like that Persona style, breakdown of personalities and rebuilding of it's a lot more ethereal, I guess.
Yeah, and I typically like that, but it didn't quite work for me. This one, even though it was very hard to watch, I was on board with where the story was going. But I definitely like the director. I mean, doing really good stuff. And again, Elizabeth Moss is just...
She's one of the best
a great actress. Yeah. And then I last thing I'll mention is Did watch Last Black Man in San Francisco, which is another one that's been on a lot of best movies of 2019. I didn't love it as much as I wanted to going in, but for a first-time director, thought it was pretty amazing. And I think it suffered from the same thing a lot of first-time directors do, where they try to cram and overstuff the film with all these ideas. And I love the surrealism of it. I loved how literary it was.
Also got kind of a stage play aesthetic too in the drama, like the way almost like existential, like surrealism kind of stage plays.
Yeah, like Waiting for Godard.
Godot, yeah.
Godot.
Yeah.
Godard.
It's a great title though.
Yeah. But yeah, it definitely gave me a lot of vibes of that too. And I thought that the performance by the main character's friend, who ultimately he does, a big stage play at the end, that was some remarkable acting.
Yeah.
I think he really anchored the film from an acting standpoint.
I think he was the only like professional in the main cast. So
yeah, I think didn't the director and the main character actually grow up together, and it's kind of based on Jimmy's real life.
Yeah.
One other interesting thing I'll mention, because this might come up on Best of 2019 for some people, but you could tell he was not an actor. I felt like in a way his performance was kind of flat because he isn't a professional actor. This is not his thing, but it gave it this weird surreal vibe where he's sort of muted and he's just kind of watching all this crazy stuff around him. And I thought it kind of worked.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely heightens the absurdism to see this like person just sort of nonchalantly reacting to this. Basically, it's about gentrification, like taking over San Francisco and pushing them out to Oakland, which happened to a lot of black people and like artists and people who, can't afford $1 million homes. And it is sort of an absurd scenario to try to live in this city that no longer wants you, and you're kind of dwelling there like a ghost. I actually did write a lot about Waiting for Godot in relation to it when I reviewed the movie. Mm-hmm. And I think it's intentional, the way he's like oddly reacting to this situation, almost as if he's pretending it's not happening. Like he's like going about his life in a way that does not directly correlate to real life events. Like he's acting one way, and the situation around him is definitely not in line with his mentality. And you know that it can't last forever, and that's kind of like the sadness of the movie.
Going into it, the last thing I'll mention is I thought it was going to be just an obvious sort of story about gentrification. It ended up being something I thought much deeper and poignant about, kind of the stories we tell ourselves and how we give our lives meaning, and even about where we come from, the houses that we live in, like, and kind of the mythology we build for ourselves, and how when that gets confronted with reality or that gets torn down, how devastating that could be. And I think that's central to like Jimmy's character and his arc, and ultimately sort of revelations that happen towards the end. So very interesting, very surreal. It looked beautiful.
Oh yeah, the opening portraits of like people as he's like skateboarding by them on the street is really beautiful.
The first like 10 minutes is probably like one of the best opening scenes of any movie I've seen this year by far. So yeah, definitely one to check out. Again, just trying to catch up on 2019 stuff. It's hard because there was a lot of good movies this year that I missed. But what about yourself? Have you been...
Same thing, but I've been going more for like weird, tiny stuff. Mm-hmm. I watched this movie called Wounds on Hulu.
I watched it.
Okay, so this movie has like an 18% on Rotten Tomatoes.
I really
I
enjoyed
fucking
it.
love this movie.
Yeah.
It's so good.
I actually was going to bring this up in regards to like New Orleans, because more than any other movie, this feels like it was definitely made by a New Orleanian, but we've watched a lot of movies set in New Orleans, and you can kind of tell by the architecture, whatever, it's in New Orleans, but it doesn't really feel made by someone that lives here. Whereas this one, he's like, yeah, let's go to the Fly. And like, that would never be
He's
in
wearing like
Hollywood.
a Morgus shirt through like half the film.
Yeah, I like those little touches where it felt really authentic.
Okay, so it gets even more specific than that for me, though. So I'm watching this movie, and I'm like, God, this reminds me so much of when I worked in a bar uptown, when I used to work at the pub. The guy who wrote the book this is based on also worked as a bartender at the pub.
I read that. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Did y'all work together at the same time?
I don't remember him, if so. I think he left before I started working there. I only worked there for like 2 years, so I'm not like part of the service industry, like
I gotcha.
Hierarchy there. But you're watching Armie Hammer play this like handsome bartender at this like sort of nasty uptown bar
which is not a real bar, right?
No.
Okay.
Actually, I recognize it as a wedding venue that my friend got married at on the West Bank, so the geography's a little off, but it looks legit.
Okay.
And yeah, he has at home this, nice place to live with this like live-in fiance character played by Dakota Johnson, who's sort of like this blank slate and is just too busy to even like deal with his bullshit. And he, is an insomniac because he works the graveyard shift at a bar and spends his entire time at the bar trying to seduce patrons like Zazie Beetz. That character reminds me so much of like hunky bartenders who worked at that same bar. Like I know that archetype.
100%. I'm with you.
And what's so great about it is he's a functioning alcoholic, and you watch over the film how easy it is for the functioning part to fall apart and for his alcoholism to just ruin his life.
Right. As soon as like the relationships start to fall apart,
yeah,
and losing a job, that like fun alcoholic party type
handsome boy
right, easily turns into something much, much darker
and bitter and gross. And by the end of the film, I'm not going to give away too much, but he has nothing left. Like all he has is rot and gross and nasty, just mush of a nothing.
Cockroaches.
Yeah. And that's what's great about this film too, is that not only do I recognize, this version of a hyper local specific functioning alcoholic archetype, it's also a Lovecraftian horror film about this like haunted cell phone, which is another trope that, I'm very personally connected to. That's like one of my favorite genres is like haunted internet stuff. And it brings in this like unknowable evil in his life that the movie never fully explains, but it does come with this really horrific imagery that I thought was legitimately scary.
Yes.
And it is connected in that the Lovecraft like unknowable cosmic horror that comes through the cell phone is tied to cockroaches in some way, which if you've ever lived in New Orleans, you know that cockroaches are just part of our lives here. Like they just find a way to establish themselves in your home from time to time.
Another part I identified with was how he, he's like a college dropout, probably I think he's in his like early 30s, but he's like hanging out, like I think he's dating someone in college, and he talks about like, oh, I'm going to the Fly, and sort of everyone knows that guy that never quite like grew up, is stuck in like college mode. And again, the fact that he's still out all night drinking and not really making a life for himself, like identify with that so much, because I know so many people, especially in this city,
in the service industry,
that fall into that trap.
And when I worked at that bar in particular was after I graduated college, and I was trying to get, a legitimate job, and eventually we got out of there. But like, there was definitely a few years when I worked in like bar jobs and restaurants and things where like I had already got my degree and I couldn't get like a real life started. That easily could have fallen apart to just me like living in a cockroach infested apartment on a friend's couch. The complaint about this movie is that it's a bunch of weird, freaky shit thrown on the screen for no reason, and that there's no story here. And I strongly disagree with that. I
strongly disagree too.
I think it has a very purposeful trajectory if you watch where he starts at the beginning of the film and where he ends up at the end. Once his like, handsomeness and charm doesn't like overcome his hurdles.
Like he does have a life in the beginning, but it's hanging on by a thread.
Right.
His relationship's really not that great. His job is pretty shitty, but he has a job. And like you said, I've been there too. After I graduated, I was just like delivering pizzas, getting off at 2 a.m, going out to bars, like
trying to dawn.
Yeah, like single, like I had no idea what I was doing with my life. And again, like it would have been so easy to fall into that exact same state. So I really liked it. I thought it was awesome.
Yeah. So one more on Hulu. It's called Aniara. It's Aniara. It's a Swedish science fiction picture. Have you heard about this one?
No.
Okay. So it's a spaceship in the future. Global warming has like destroyed Earth, and people are sort of shuttling back and forth from Earth to a colony on Mars. There's these giant like cruise ship alien ships that are going back and forth. One of them with like hundreds of people on it gets thrown off course and just starts drifting in deep space. And instead of taking a couple days to get from one planet to the other, like, some people are going to business meetings on Mars or like going to see their kids like soccer game or something. All of a sudden it's like, oh no, it's going to take us 2 years to get back. And then 2 years turns into longer and then longer and longer. And the people who are stuck in this like permanent cruise, like business cruise, are like, having to form new societies and new rules and new religions on this spaceship that's going to nowhere and has like a promise of, oh yeah, one day we'll return to Earth, but there's no sign that will ever happen. So a lot of existential dread on this ship as well. This is another movie that's been sort of derided as just not purposeful and not interesting, and I really liked it. There's some weird sex cult stuff that starts to happen as they get bored. There's some virtual reality simulations of like, basically there's this computer that can get in your head and spark memories of nature on Earth before it was completely destroyed. And people become addicted to using that escapism now that they're stuck on the ship, and it like reconnects them to nature. And that addiction like gets out of hand and becomes a religion in its own way too. And it's about like how, as we're traveling on this spaceship, Earth, that's like dying and running out of resources, what purpose do we have? And like what, like it's almost got like a philosophical bent of like, what are we even doing at this point if we're all in decline? And what's the purpose of anything? And how do we create purpose in those dying days? And like, what is the ethics of bringing a child into a situation like that?
Yeah.
On that way, it reminded me a lot of High Life, which I know is a movie you did not enjoy, but I think people who were frustrated with High Life's sort of like cruelty and cold distance and like stubbornness to like be a clear story, I think this one does a lot of the same things thematically, but is just more engaging on like an emotional linear storytelling level. And it does get weird in its own way as the years start piling up and their life on the spaceship just gets more and more disconnected from like how life on Earth used to be. And yeah, if you want to like process global warming, climate change things through like a sci-fi genre lens, I don't think anything has done it better than this like weird Swedish movie that's just sort of quietly sitting on Hulu. It's really good.
Dude, that just tickled so, because like you're talking about the existential dread, then the philosophy of like, you know, climate change and bring a child into the world and what is our purpose? Like if we're ultimately doomed, all that is like connecting with me. I definitely want to check that out.
It's really good. I think that is one of the stronger films of the year that's not getting talked about enough. I put it on the same level as High Life, which I really liked. I think they're doing very similar things in different ways. So I do think if one person was frustrated by High Life, they might, you know, find similar thematic resonance here with a more satisfying like follow through maybe.
Yeah, and I did love the kind of themes and the look of High Life, but ultimately I need some narrative, and I didn't get that from that film. And it sounds like this one might give me the same thing in a more palatable way.
It's less of an artsy fartsy indulgence. It's less High Life on a visual level and more like Sci-Fi Channel, like Battlestar Galactica stuff.
Right.
The main character is a crew member of the ship who has like a job. So it's a lot of like daily labor on this like sci-fi situation. But, you know, as it goes on and the situation gets worse, things get much weirder than that.
Okay.
But yeah, I highly recommend it. I think y'all would like it in particular.
Yeah, definitely check that out.
And then one more quick one. On Netflix, they just added I Lost My Body, which I watched last night.
Oh, I started watching it. I didn't finish it, though.
I like it.
It was just super late and I fell asleep. It wasn't bad, but...
It's a French animated film. It's relatively short. It's about this severed hand that lost its body. It wakes up in a refrigerator in a science lab and sort of scuttles off across the ground, kind of like Thing from Addams Family. And it's looking for its body. Half the movie is this like action adventure of the hand, like fighting pigeons and rats and like avoiding getting crushed by like modes of transportation as it scuttles across the city. That is very exciting. I love that stuff so much. The other half is this like twee romance about this guy who's like really awkward and doesn't know how to hit on this woman he's in love with. And he eventually establishes a connection with her, but it's like on false pretenses. That part, not as good. But the fact that those two stories are working in conjunction with each other is just delightfully weird. Like, it's just a weird combination of things. To have this, like, action horror thing of this, like, severed hand and this, like, wistful twee romance. Like, it's a fun combination. So, I think Wounds and Aniara are going to register on my, like, favorite films of the year somewhere on the list. But that one, I was just more tickled by it and found it very strange.
The genre mashup.
Yeah. And there's just not enough 2D animation in the world in general. A lot of it comes from Japan, which I enjoy that stuff, but it was just nice to see like someone else take a crack at it in an unusual way.
Like you said, it's a short watch too, so definitely check that one out.
Yeah, and that's on Netflix. That's a lot. We're also going to talk about more 2019 movies coming up.
Oh, yeah.
One more crowd pleaser and one more divisive film.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the general theme of the day is vertical class warfare. So, like, class warfare between people above ground and below ground, I think would encompass all three of the movies we're about to talk about. And all that's coming up to you right now.
South Korean filmmaker Bong Joon-ho's masterpiece, Parasite, seems to be a big hit in North America. According to the website Box Office Mojo, Parasite, which won top honors at the Cannes Film Festival, earned more than $11 million at the North American box office as of Sunday, becoming the year's highest grossing foreign film.
And now it's time for our Movie of the Minute. This is where hosts of the show bounce back and forth recommending films to each other. And for this episode, I forced James to drag himself out to see Parasite.
I mean, I'm glad you did.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a crowd-pleasing movie that's been like selling out like art house slots. It hasn't made a ton of money, but for its like size and the fact that it's like a Korean film, I think it's made a phenomenal amount of money. And you'll even hear like news articles about like it being like a cultural sensation.
One, I think the director Bong Joon-ho, you know, he did Okja, he did The Host,
Snowpiercer.
So I think his name has kind of been more and more in the conversation.
It also won the Palme d'Or at Cannes this year, so it's got like sort of a prestige about it, like almost like Oscar season buzz, even though it's a weird genre film. And Bong Joon-ho makes like, I would say, ambitious genre movies that are like way over the top and like exaggerated in their themes. But this one is a little more of a slow build and like works its way up to the ridiculous parts. So like a lot of people, I mean, Snowpiercer was our favorite movie of 2014, which was like one of our first posts we ever did as a website. A lot of people will look at Snowpiercer and be like, oh, that movie's ridiculous. It's so silly. It's a cartoon. Where this one, I think it allows you to take it seriously, even though it does get to as ridiculous of a class warfare theme.
And I do think this movie plays around with more genres than any of his other films have. You have elements of, you do have that social satire, but you have elements of like a thriller, a drama, even some comedic elements too, and they all work in this movie. It's pretty amazing what he was able to pull off.
Yeah, and that's an Asian sensibility, I think, in filmmaking. Like, you'll even see it in like Indian films, Japanese films. Hong Kong films used to do this, where it's like every tone and genre packed into like one story, whereas like an American movie will typically stick to like one tone
stick
throughout.
To one, yeah. And I do find though in foreign films that do that, usually one element or genre will work better than others. I think this is pretty remarkable in the way that they all work and the way that they kind of escalate and build on one another, and to have like really suspenseful moments with interjections of comedy. This is one of those things where it was very hyped up going into it and totally lived up to the hype.
Yeah.
It's pretty undeniable how great it is.
It's a fun watch too. Like, it's not like eating your vegetables. Like the whole time there are jokes throughout, and it's like sort of ribbing you in the side even when it's being serious and building up to the sort of explosion towards the end. So the story is about this family of grifters. They live in a shitty apartment and take odd jobs like folding pizza boxes to like make do. But they're looking for a way to make consistent money because they do a lot of like paid piecemeal labor. They get a break when the son gets hired as an English tutor for a student in this rich person's house, much higher up vertically uphill in this like mansion that was actually built for the movie. It's like a really exquisite piece of like set design.
Yeah, and just real quick, that did remind me of a film we talked about before, Burning, specifically to Korea or South Korea, like that sharp divide between the poor and the rich.
That's not anything that's like strange to Bong Joon-ho's movies either, because the whole trajectory of Snowpiercer is the poor people at the back of the train fighting their way physically to the front, and as they fight their way up, they go through more and more like wealthier cars, and then when they get to the front, the wealthiest man on the train is waiting for them. This one, it's just as geographically literal, like the class divide. It's just vertical instead of horizontal. So the son lies about his credentials, and he can teach English. He just doesn't have like the education to prove it. And he makes quick work of seducing the daughter to fall in love with him, just so he can like sort of get his claws deeper into this house and not leave it. And he also starts getting jobs for his other family members. Like, he lies about his sister's credentials and gets her a job as like an art therapist. He frames other or together the siblings frame other members of the household for like things they didn't do wrong. And the mother and the father get jobs there as well. And they displace other people who are in need of jobs so that they can get established in this house.
Yep.
I guess we can go spoilers in this movie. A lot of people have seen it by now, I would think. Because this is the point, I think, where like once they're all established in the house and they're working for this wealthy couple and they're like their kids.
I mean, I think because there's a lot I want to talk about with this movie, because thematically there's so much there. And it's talking about like so much in class in like a really nuanced way, in a way that I don't feel like Snowpiercer to me was very black and white.
It's like a comic book, yeah.
This was like shades of gray. And to talk about that, you do have to kind of talk about, I don't know if you want to call it a twist or a shift in the story, but you basically think you're watching one thing like, oh, this is kind of funny. He's getting all his family members' job, and look how they're kind of like getting one over on these rich people that are clueless. And then it happens.
Okay. So let's say what happens is it turns out the people whose jobs they took over have, problems of their own. They're also poor, and they own a lot of money to a loan shark that is tormenting them. There's one lady in particular who seems like this like sort of, I want to say, stuck-up tyrant in the house. Mm-hmm. It turns out that she's just like desperately holding onto this job and pretending to be a perfectionist because she is keeping her husband alive in the basement of the home by sneaking food to him. He is losing his mind down there and has come to worship the head of the household as like a god, more or less. And that's where the term parasite starts to come in. Like, all of these poor people are living in this house under false pretenses and feeding off of the wealth.
Yeah, leeching off of the wealth of the upper class. Yeah.
And I want to say the subtlety of the wealth divide here that you're referring to is the fact that the poor people have to fuck each other over to fight for those crumbs. And the people that you initially are cheering for succeeding in like supplanting someone else, you start to realize they're actually doing real damage to other people's lives. And the small corner of the rich person's house that they're fighting for doesn't seem like much, but they will fight to the death to control it. Mm-hmm. Which at the end results in like real bloodshed and gets really gross. And then there's this really beautiful, denouement at the end where the kid is looking back and is like, I'm going to buy my family out of this routine. Eventually, I will live in that house and I will free them from this cycle. And we know as an audience that will never fucking happen because everyone's sort of stuck in their roles here.
Yeah, the son has sort of like internalized the idea of kind of like the American dream. Like, if I just work hard enough, I can buy this house for my family one day. And it's just a pipe dream. It's never going to happen. Yeah. And that's where like the tragic elements come in.
The best you can hope for is to feed off of the wealth from the basement and like kill yourself trying to survive. It gets really nasty and violent, but it's also like really fun throughout. And I think the cruelest things that happen in the movie are poor people fighting each other over scraps.
Well, and something I loved about this movie that I think in an interview the director said he wanted you to root for nobody and everybody at the same time, which is kind of the vibe of this. Like, in the beginning, you are rooting for the family. Like, oh, yeah, these, like, rich people, they're so out of touch. Like, why not kind of con them and get yourself in a better position? But throughout the movie, you kind of see the holes in that logic, and you see that the poor family, like, has their problems, too. It's not trying to paint this black and white picture of, like, oh, these are the protagonists and the rich people are the evil ones. It's like the rich family is kind of out of touch and they don't have any real concern for the problems of poor people, which feels pretty true to the way, I think a lot of upper class people don't actively hate poor people. I think they just like don't have their concerns in mind. It's just like,
but that's a problem though, that their existence and their like daily lives are causing like all this bloodshed just outside of their eye line. Like there's a lot of horrific shit that's happening just so they can maintain this like status quo. Whether or not they know it or recognize it, it's still like their daily lives are like causing pain.
But I think the movie does a good job of not like vilifying them as like bad people. It's sort of like their class has sort of blinded them to the problems of the everyday working person. And it does a really good job of, I think, like showing the nuance and the gray area of class in a way that, again, like Snowpiercer didn't really touch on. And I think it's hard for a film to even address that because it gets kind of murky.
I did hate them though.
Did you?
Yeah, because
even
it's a slow build
mother character or the matriarch of the house.
Not as much as the man, but the way he talks about how poor people
The
smell
smell.
alike, and how that smell disgusts him,
and that's ultimately what leads to the bloodshed.
Right. And there's also that scene where they are having sex on the couch and they're like fetishizing poverty.
Yeah.
Really gross to me. Like that's like society level, like rich people are evil alien beings that are not human. That is a very human moment to have like a specific fetish that's like a taboo and that you're like enjoying privately. But I guess because it's at someone's expense and they are unknowingly like 3 feet away listening to their troubles being like fetishized, there is a cruelty to it whether or not you know you're hurting another person.
Mm-hmm.
And then also there's a really large flood sequence in this movie that floods the shitty apartment that becomes literally shitty because sewage backs up and floods their entire house. So there's just shit gurgling up from the floor and ruining everything they own. And then they go back to the rich people's house and they're like, oh yeah, it was rainy last night. It was very inconvenient. I had to cut my camping trip short. Now we have to throw a party. Isn't that like annoying? So yeah, maybe the villain is the wealth itself and not the people because they don't have a malicious intent.
That's what I'm getting at. I feel like that is this movie's point of view.
But I still get so angry anytime they say anything because it's just like, do you not realize how much hurt you're causing with these like sort of microaggressions?
But I don't think they do.
They don't, but it still hurts.
But I think also, not that the film vilifies poor people, but the family itself is portrayed as like kind of a family of con artists that also, when they do get a little bit of money, they spend it on beer and candy instead of like investing in their future or something, which is what's used to like vilify poor people all the time. Like, but I feel like it's addressing that and saying like, well, of course, if you have no hope and no opportunity and you get a little bit of money you make from this, like, of course you're going to buy some beer and like have a good time, feel good in the moment. So there's like nuance to the class thing that I feel like no other movie has really tried to address, because it's easy to just say the poor people that are working, they're the good ones and the rich people are the evil ones. And this movie, in a way I haven't seen any other movie do it, really addresses the nuance there of class.
Well, yeah, the best they could ever hope for is like a dry cigarette on the toilet while it's exploding with shit. Like,
yeah.
Like that moment, I think, is one of the best scenes in the film. Is like everyone's kind of scrambling to, recover what little possessions they can from like the shit flood that's ruining their lives, and she just calmly has a cigarette on the toilet as this like temporary pleasure to sort of like distract herself from the shit flood of life.
This existence sucks.
Yeah, I think you're right. That is a very subtle thing to do. Is it fair to say that he makes subtle points, but in like a non-subtle way? Like, the movie's constantly reminding you of the fact that everything's a metaphor. They get this, like, ceremonial rock early in the film, and the kid holds it up. He's like, it's so metaphorical. Mm-hmm. And, like, the trip down from the rich people's house into the shit flood is a very long, like, vertical descent into the lower parts of the hill. And it really emphasizes just how many stairs you have to walk down to get to where they live by foot. So the movie's not subtle in its like class distinctions, and it becomes like this like bloodshed thriller by the end where there's like this explosion of violence. Basically, I'm saying it's not like Shoplifters or Burning where like everything is understated. It's a very overstated film, even if it does make like more subtle points.
Overstated with nuanced point of view.
Yeah.
I think would be a good way to characterize it, which I really like.
Yeah, and I prefer this mode to something like Burning or Shoplifters, even though I think those are good films. Shoplifters more so than Burning. But I think this one is just more fun to watch. Is that fair to say? Like, I really like stylistically showy movies. So if you can still do that like work of making nuanced like class and like thematic discussions of like real social issues and still be a showy filmmaker with like, you know, genre payoffs. Like I respect that way more than if you just like do that like art house thing where you say important things in a hushed tone. Like I'm always going to be more drawn to something like this where it's like over the top and nuanced.
Well, and I agree. And I think that's kind of where our taste
overlap.
This film feels like a perfect overlapping of our tastes, where I was really big on Burning and Shoplifters because I like the understated thing that's about important topics in a, you know, nuanced way. But I also, and you know, I do like just entertaining films, and this is a perfect marriage of the two. Again, making subtle points while being entertaining as hell. It's just fun to watch.
Yeah. I will say, I think the thing that it says that no other film has said before in a way, for me, is the way that capitalism forces the lower class to fight over scraps. I think I've seen the sort of temporary pleasures and like the microaggressions and everything else in this film done before, not quite in this way, but I don't know if I've ever seen poor people fighting over crumbs in so small and sad of a way. Like they're fighting to be the head parasite.
Well, it's usually like rich versus poor, but that doesn't really feel true to the economic system that we're in nowadays. It is, the system itself has forced the poor to fight each other, and to also, like I talked about with the son character, internalizing that idea of like the American dream. If I just like work hard enough and I'm like smarter and better than these other people, like I can be one of those rich people. And I feel like that mindset is actually really destructive, and it's also delusional. And I think that's ultimately the tragedy of the film. You know, you were talking about like the denouement at the end, that he still, after all this stuff he's seen, he still believes there's a way out. I can own this $4 million house. I just got to like pass my exams and work hard, and I can house me and my family. And it's like you've kind of internalized these ideas that aren't going to help you, or kind of an escape from your situation.
I almost wonder if like the more mature thing to do is what the older men do, which is hide in the basement and like come out in the day to forage for food like a bug. The way they live is pathetic and untenable and will likely get them in trouble
but
at
it's
some
real.
point. But that is a lot more realistic than I'm going to own that house one day, which will never fucking happen.
I mean, to your point, there's that great scene after the flood where they're in like a shelter. And doesn't the father say something to that effect to the son? If you expect nothing out of life, if you have no expectations, if you think everything is going to fail, then ultimately you'll be happier, because the little glimmer of hope you have will be this like revelation, as opposed to thinking like that you can be in a state that you'll never be able to achieve. Man,
it's just a really well curated film, like visually, in just how the house is set up and has its own upper floor and lower floor, and how that's part of like a microcosm of like the larger city structure where like the rich people live up high, the poor people live down low. And then that sort of echoes out even further to like capitalist like differences in class, where like there is a wealth class that you are born into and maintain, and there's a lower class you will never, you know, fight your way out of, but you have to feed off of the upper class to get by because they have all the resources. So yeah. I think it is a really smartly done film, even just in the fact that they built that house to like echo that separation. I think it's just like really well considered and meticulously curated, but feels like fun and loose in a weird way. It has a sort of messy tonal quality, even though you never feel like Bong Joon-ho is like not in control of what you're watching. Like it feels like he was purposeful in every single scene, even if he lets it get weird selectively.
One last thing I'll say about the because you were talking about the flood and how for the rich people it's just like, oh, we had a flood and we had to cut our camping trip short, and for the family it's like, well, our house is completely
everything
destroyed.
I own is gone.
And I felt like it did that a few times during the movie to show like the same event can affect the rich and the poor differently. And another one, you know, like communication too, like the rich family communication is kind of this fun, it's like a toy, you know, the kid has like walkie-talkies, and meanwhile the poor family is searching for Wi-Fi so they can check to see if they got a job application. It's like like communication is like life and death for the poor, and for the rich is just sort of like a fun tool, like a toy essentially.
Or like how the poor family will eat like grilled shit meat with like ramen to get by as a group, and the rich family will make instant ramen with like the most expensive steak you can purchase, because it's a fun indulgence to like eat poor for a night, but they'll eat like the nicest steak to go with it as like comfort food.
Or also like when the matriarch of the rich family like takes him like shopping, and it's like this big chore, like, oh, I got to go shopping and buy all this stuff for this party we're going to have. Oh, it's so stressful. And she can just point to this and throw it in the basket, point to that. And meanwhile, he's like starving.
Yeah.
Again, I don't think it's trying to say that the rich are trying to actively destroy the poor. It's more, they just have no fucking clue what it's like.
Does intent matter at that point if the effect is the same, though?
I don't know. Like, that's up for each person to decide. But I think that is what the movie is.
Because when those things happen, it's not like, oh, wow, they really don't understand. No, you feel it like cut you. You're like, oh God, do you not realize how much pain you're causing? It's horrible.
I think with the mother character, it's sort of that like naive, she really has no idea. She's just in her bubble. Again, with the father character talking about the smell of the poor, and he's saying, don't cross that line. You know, oh, we can be friends, but don't try to like...
Always remember you're my employee.
Yeah, and like remember your place. He is more nefarious, I think, in his attitude. And ultimately, he's the one that brings about the violent event at the end of the film. So again, there's like nuance to all this stuff that I think is like very interesting. And that with like the different genres and how effectively he does those and how like in control he is of his film. This is great. I mean, it's like one of the best movies of the year. There's really no denying it, for me at least. Keep on in, on in, on in.
So a much less crowd-pleasing, everyone's satisfied 2019 release from this year was Jordan Peele's Us, which I really liked when it first came out, and James did not like, which we talked about in like the What Have You Been Watching Lately, top of the episode intros. But I never really got a full handle on what you didn't like about the movie, and I was kind of looking for a reason to bring it back up just to see if maybe that opinion would change like over the course of the year. And I think Parasite was a good in for that. Us is another like unsubtle class warfare film. It's also got this like vertical divide between classes, but I would say it's set up as much less anchored in reality. It's more of a surreal metaphor about class divide, even though it will clearly state its themes. The physical dissociation between the wealth and the poor is very unreal. Basically, there are doppelgangers of every person that lives in America under the surface of America, living in these like series of tunnels. And everything you do, there's this like clone that's been made of you by the government that mirrors your movements. This is explained about halfway into the film, not very clearly.
I'm glad you admitted that.
Yeah, it's not explained exactly the nature of their association with us. It almost feels like supernatural and not scientific. And we don't really get a lot of over explanation of how this shit works.
That is what bothers me so much.
And I think that's what I love about the movie. It reminded me a lot of Sion Sono's Suicide Club, which is another messy movie with like these really like overstated themes. In this film, we have this like family that's keeping up with the Joneses, right? It's this black family that are vacationing at the beach, and their white friends have nicer stuff than them. They have like a nicer boat. They have a nicer house. Their kids are like well behaved.
But they're still both able to afford a vacation home.
But their version of the vacation home is like slightly dinkier.
Slightly, yeah.
It's like it's not quite as nice as this white family, and they're like keeping up with them. And the whole time that they're doing this, they don't realize that this doppelganger version of themselves that live under the ground, who are called the Tethered, are, you know, mimicking them. And it's like further down the line, there's someone who doesn't have it as nice as you and is mimicking you. And a lot like in Parasite, they are causing pain and harm to this tethered family that is living this like subhuman life of the have-nots beneath them, and their sort of everyday actions are not intended to hurt these people, but they are causing them just like immense strife. So like when one of them gives birth with cesarean section above ground, the other one is getting cut open and having a baby ripped out of them below ground. Whenever they eat a fancy meal, the tethered only eat rabbit, basically raw. And I don't know if you know this, but like rabbit meat cannot sustain you. Like if you just ate rabbit meat, you would die of starvation because it doesn't have like nutrients to like. So like they just have like a shittier version of everything that people on the surface have. And at a certain point, the tethered below the surface have had enough and basically have this violent upheaval where they claim class warfare and start cutting up everyone on the surface with these scissors, and then form a human chain across America, mimicking the Hands Across America commercial from the 80s, for reasons that are also half explained, but not really clear. I love this mess. It is a very ambitious film with like a ton of ideas. It is visually striking. Like the tethered all have this like red jumpsuit costume with like these like gold scissors. It's like an instant Halloween costume. And it's hyper violent. I think it's hilarious. Tim Heidecker, in particular, playing the tethered version of the rich asshole, where he's just like on his boat, mimicking what a rich jerk would be doing on a boat.
He's also like drunk, like because when you think about the tethered version, just has to experience whatever.
Yeah. So he's wasted drunk.
So he's just wasted, and that's kind of what. I thought his like tethered version was very funny.
Elizabeth Moss playing a cruel drunk wife, also really fun to watch in this movie. Lupita Nyong'o, who plays the main character, who has former experience with the tethered unlike anyone else on the surface, it appears. She has a very subtle performance where she's not letting on as much as she should to her family about how much she knows about these people and like her experience with them, and that sort of comes out over the course of the movie. So that's the mystery that's solved, is her relationship with the people underground. What's not solved is how any of this shit works. And you just have to sort of buy into the cosmic terror of the fact that there's a doppelganger of you that wants to kill you with scissors and take over your life. And I think it makes a lot of the same points as Parasite in the way that capitalism and wealth causes harm to others, whether or not you're aware of it. It's just the way it makes those points is a lot looser and weirder. I personally enjoyed this movie even more than Get Out, which was Jordan Peele's like beloved debut as a filmmaker. That movie, I think, is very meticulously calculated, where every single thing in the script is like really well thought out and has a place and like deals directly in metaphor and is like a reference to something else somewhere in the script. It works like a clock. This movie is less of a clock and more of just like a weird nightmare someone woke up from and like tried to write down all the details and didn't quite get it all. So yeah, that's why I love this movie. It is a upsetting, gross mess of a film that is more interesting to think about because there's hairs out of place and it's hard to like really pinpoint how it works. And I really appreciate that kind of like cosmic horror.
But I don't think the metaphor works.
What do you think is missing there?
So you talked about it's about capitalism, but is it really like, so I'm normally not the type to get wrapped up in plot holes.
Yeah, I don't care about plot at all.
Right, and we've talked about this, and most of the time, plot holes don't bother me. Like continuity errors bother me. If there's like a cup on a table one scene and the cup's not there the next, it takes me out of the movie sort of thing. But plot holes, I don't really have a problem with usually. And what I found striking about this movie is like there were so many plot holes that like I could not get over it.
What's the plot hole?
There's a million plot.
Name one.
Okay, so the young boy in the family, there's a scene towards the end where he interacts with his tethered version of himself, and they like set this trap where they get them to go to this burned out car, and it turns out there's actually gas, and they're going to try to light them on fire, and the son realizes this, and he puts up his arms, and he walks backwards, and the tethered version does the exact same thing, leading him into his ultimate demise in the fire.
Yeah.
Now, explain that to me in a sense of like everything we've seen before in the movie is they're tethered, but they don't exactly mimic their movements. Why in this one instance is the son able to manipulate the tethered version to do exactly what he wants to kill himself?
I think they all could control the other people the way he does in that moment. They just don't realize it. And I think the tethered, their nature is to mimic the people above board. That's why they were created, and that's what they do. But they're fighting against their nature for this coup. Like, they are actively going against everything that's been ingrained with them to take over the lives of the people on the surface and put an end to it. But their natural state is still to mimic what the people are doing. When they first attack these people and like come onto them and like invade their homes, like, a lot of this is like a home invasion movie. When they invade their homes and are like, we're taking over, people usually just freeze in fear. Like that first scene where they're all sitting on the couch looking at the tethered versions of themselves and like listening to this like really creepy monologue from Lupita Nyong'o where she's like, we are Americans.
That line still kind of makes me cringe. What?
Oh, I love it.
I can't. It's not even on the nose. It's like shoving it in your...
Why do you care about subtlety all of a sudden? Like, why does it have to be subtle?
It doesn't have... No, it doesn't have to be subtle. And the We Are Americans thing, I can kind of rationalize because Hands Across America, they grew up watching worshiping this video, and We Are Americans. That, again, like, as I'm watching it, I'm trying to make sense of all this stuff in my brain. And that one I can excuse. Like, okay, they're Americans because We Are American thing. But some of the other stuff... Okay, another example. All the other tethered, when they come out from the subterranean sewers, so to speak, they immediately are like killing the other versions of themselves. But for some reason, this family of doppelgangers does this thing. It's the thing I hate in like all Bond movies.
But they like over-explain the talking villain.
Well, it's like instead of just killing you instantaneously and taking your spot, I'm going to like handcuff you and give you this long monologue where no other tether does that in the movie. Like Elizabeth Moss and Tim Heidecker, what do? Immediately when they get a chance, they kill them. When we see it on the TV newscasting, they kill all the people immediately. But this one family, why are they the ones that we're going to tie you up and give you this long
Because those other
monologue?
people you're watching, the other tethered, are radicalized soldiers that have been trained and radicalized by Lupita Nyong'o's tethered character. She is different than every other person down there, which the movie does eventually explain in its like final reveal. She is not like the other people there. She is a different nature, and she was born differently.
I mean, I get what you're explaining.
Do you see what I'm saying? Like, she was not born down there. She does not.
No, and that's ultimately why she's the one to kind of radicalize him.
Yeah.
And that's also the reason that she's the only one that can actually talk. All the other ones just grunt.
And she can barely talk.
Barely talk. Yeah. There's more. Okay. The whole story about the government did experiments to like create these doppelgangers. First, they started with rabbits. Then they did it on humans. Now, my question is like, or my critique is like, if this is a film about capitalism, wouldn't it make more sense to put these doppelgangers to use in a capitalistic sense? Like, put them to actual work. From a thematic standpoint, wouldn't it make more sense to have these people in the sewers actually doing work to help prop up the society while the more well-to-do people get to go on vacations and have leisure? But instead, they do nothing with these people that they've created. And to me, a better film would have really struck that home of like, okay, the people in the bottom, in the subterranean, are actually doing all the menial work to like keep society going while the rich people get to have their like vacations and their whatever. But instead, it's like this beautiful metaphor is like right in front of Jordan Peele's face, and he like doesn't take it.
I don't think it's the same thing. I think that they're living hollow versions of real lives. Their life is pointless down there, and they can affect no change, and they're just going through the motions of trying to live these like normal American lives, which is mirroring what the central family is doing with the slightly wealthier white family that they're friends with. Like, they're living like a hollow... That guy doesn't want a boat. He just wants a boat because his rich friend has a boat. So he has like a shittier, less functional version of that boat. And then the people under the ground are living this hollow fax, like a faxed copy of a real life. And it's pointless and it's meaningless. And the government experiment was failed, but they still have these like people just sort of around, and basically all that can happen is they get harmed by the people they're attached to.
But instead of going up to the real world and killing them, what I would like is for them to come up and like want to switch places. Like instead of killing them, take them down.
That's not something that happened on a large scale, but that is something that has happened in the movie with an individual character.
But I'm saying their plan is ultimately like, we're going to come up to the surface, kill them, and hold hands across America. Like, what kind of grand plan is that? It doesn't make
it's
any
like a
sense.
demonstration almost. Like it reads like a political statement, and it is empty. What good could they do? Like, once they get up there and usurp the ruling class that they have to like mimic in these like hollow fake versions of like a real life, what is left? Like, they've been so tormented and have so limited of a like scope of what life is. There's no good that could come out of this situation by the end.
Well, that's unsatisfying. It's like the last image of this film is all these people from the subterranean holding hands, and we have these giant military helicopters that are probably going to assassinate them or whatever. Like, what is this film really trying to say about class struggle?
It reminds me a lot of the new season of The Good Place that's on TV right now, and how it's about how every decision you make in life right now, like going in the grocery store and buying a head of lettuce, causes harm somewhere off screen that you cannot see. There's no ethical life that you can live right now that doesn't cause harm to another human being, even though all you were doing is like buying food for yourself. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, every action you have is causing harm to someone else. That is a fucked up social structure. And there's really no way out of it right now. There's no way to be an ethical human being in the modern world.
Yeah, but see, The Good Place has an answer to that.
No, it does not.
Yes, it does. It's that idea of the absurd of like, well, life is like ultimately meaningless and ultimately we're all going to die and flame out, but like do the absurd thing and just like do good for good's sake because it brings happiness to the people around. It, like, there's a message in there where this film doesn't really have an ultimate like answer.
Do you crave an answer more than a question? I like that the movie is weird and open-ended and has like a
But I have no idea what it's trying to say.
It's an upsetting reflection of social structures that we live in right now.
The only thing I get from this film is like the people that are disenfranchised, if they had the same opportunities as other people, would do just as well and be successful.
Sure.
That's it. But I feel like it's trying to get at a lot more than that, and it fails. It doesn't know exactly what it's trying to say or what its point is.
It doesn't have an answer, but I think it's pointing to the haves and have-nots, like, wealth disparity that we have is causing real harm to people. And the fact that we're complicit in it, whether or not we're actively making malicious decisions, we should be punished. And there is a level of like guilt and complicity and things that will come back to get us on, even if it's only on a moral level, like maybe we won't be stabbed and taken over by someone in a red jumpsuit, but there is something wrong with the way we're living, and that feeling that there's just something off and that we're sort of like ignoring it and that it will come to fruition one day that like all this shit is untenable, I think is part of what the movie's expressing. I don't think it's a clear statement. And I don't think it has a solution to the problem.
But we were just talking about Parasite, something it's talking about a broad subject too, but it has nuance and it says something and it like makes points and it's like poignant in the way it gets its message across. This film to me is like trying to do the same thing. It's trying to be about a lot of different things, and it really doesn't get any of it across in a coherent.
I think it says almost the exact same shit, except it's cerebral and nightmarish instead of like finely tuned. And I more am drawn to that like loose, illogical connection of things where like maybe it doesn't make sense on a linear narrative, but the feeling it evokes and the imagery it conjures really gets to like an upsetting thing that goes way deeper than being told that it's wrong. Like, it just feels wrong looking at it, and it's upsetting to look at, and the associations it makes in your brain are upsetting. And I feel like that's more cinematic than telling a good linear story.
I'm not trying to completely shit on this movie. I do think the cinematography is great.
It's beautiful.
I do think watching it a second time, though, you're talking about how funny it is. I don't think it's as funny as you're making it out to be. And I actually think that the humor in the later parts of the movie undercuts the horror in a way that's pretty jarring and takes me out of it.
What's funny in the later parts? Because I think the humor kind of drops out at a certain point.
No, like when they're getting in the car and they have the whole joke about like, oh, I'm going to drive, you're handcuffed and your leg's broken. And I got the most kill count, by the way. It's like, no, I actually kill. They have this extended,
I'm laughing right now.
extended scene. But meanwhile, we're in the midst of like what's supposed to be terror. And there's moments like that in the whole second half where it's like, it takes me out of the horror of the film.
See, I think those comic relief moments are more cohesively woven into the story at that point. I think most of the humor comes up front with, you get Winston Duke playing the dad, and he's like
funny, yeah.
A stereotypical dad to like a comic degree. Like he's almost like a drag queen or like a professional wrestler version of a dad. He's like performing dad.
No, I totally agree.
That's hilarious. And I think Tim Heidecker is really funny.
Yes.
I think maybe after that initial home invasion stretch, when it starts to get to be more like an adventure film where they're like roaming around the beach city, the humor is more interspersed and it's more like a relief of tension than anything. And that's a lot different than in Get Out, where you have little Rel Howery playing that TSA agent who is like the comic relief and is like a jokester.
That worked so much better.
No, I think that's
me.
a lot clunkier. He's only serves that one function and he comes in to lighten the mood. Whereas here, I think the moments where people make jokes or like are being flippant about the situation is more like human. It's like a more humanity coming through. It's not like all of a sudden you're going to lose your sense of humor.
But the problem, this movie is way, way scarier than Get Out.
Well, thank you for admitting that, because I believe that's true.
It's true. Yeah, of course. But it feels like Jordan Peele feels the need to interject humor. Like that's his brand, his style. I get it. But again, there were parts where like I was getting scared. I was like, oh man, this is like a tense scene. And then you crack a joke and it just like took me out of it. And then I didn't feel that tension anymore.
Tension relief has always been part of a horror film, though. It's always been part of the fabric of the genre. I think that's coming from like a real like horror nerd place. And if there's any filmmaker he reminds me of, it's Wes Craven more than any other filmmaker.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Wes Craven has always done that as well. Like his movies can be very scary, but there's always like some cartoonish level of humor that like interjects in there. And I think something that Wes Craven did at the time that he could not get away with now is his movies don't always make fucking sense. And people just sort of used to accept stuff like, oh yeah, this child molester dream demon haunts teenagers. Okay, that's fine. But we can't have this untethered people 20 years later.
But there's a difference, though, in that he explains the rules of his universe in a cohesive way where I understand the rules of Freddy Krueger and Nightmare on Elm Street. They're very, like, cut and dry.
The only
rules.
rule is that he gets you when you're sleeping. That leaves a whole world open.
But you can't explain to me the rules of the
what don't you get? There are people
universe.
under the ground who mimic your every move, and one day they got fed up and decided to come up here and stab you in the fucking chest over it.
No, you're giving the like very. If that's all it was, that'd be fine.
That's it.
No, but that's not it, because the movie decides, no, we're going to get into the actual logistics of. So the government decided in the 80s we're going to create doppelgangers, and then it didn't work out for some reason, and they were left down there, and somehow like their clothes match the people up there and their movements match, but we're going to leave the situation, and now they're down there to fester. And then they explain, oh, there's all these tunnels underneath the
You're
U.S.
talking about that like there's like multiple scenes of discovery. It's like a half line. Like she says it in like a paragraph.
But why even have that? Basically, if they would have left that out, like don't even try to explain some of this stuff.
I don't think they do.
Sure they do. They talk about government experiments. The experiment didn't work, so they left. And then the people were down there to rot, I guess living off of rabbit meat. But you just said people can't live off of... So if you really follow it, what it's trying to say, it makes absolutely no fucking sense.
And thank God for it. I don't want it to make sense.
But the movie wants to have it both ways. It wants to try to like explain to you this universe while also not giving you any sort of clarity about what the rules of this universe are. How did it come to be?
I just don't believe any of this is not purposeful. I think he gives you a little bit, but it's not like a science fiction film where you're going to piece together everything that happens. There's a supernatural quality to it. One of the things that happens when the tethered are getting closer and closer and the worlds are closer to matching up is that you'll see more coincidences. Like a frisbee will land exactly in a circle that matches its size, or like you'll look at the clock and it'll be 11:11, and there's these like bars that'll like the black flag symbol, or Jeremiah 11:11 from the Bible will be on like a hobo's sign, and the coincidences will stack up, and that's the worlds coming closer together. To me, that's not a scientific situation that can be explained. It's this like supernatural dread that something is fucking wrong. The government experiment gone wrong aspect is so Spartan and like briefly referenced that the movie's not interested in explaining anything.
But what I'm saying, why even say that?
But why dwell on it? Who gives a shit? We're talking about the least interesting aspect of a movie that has so much more else going on. So everyone's going to focus on the quote-unquote plot holes raised by 3 lines of dialogue instead of everything else that's happening, which is way more interesting.
Lines of dialogue. It's this kind of movie all leads up to like the big reveal, and we have the flashback where we finally understand the whole universe we've been watching. When she actually goes into the basement, it's like this style of movie, it's like, oh, now we're going to get the answers. But why even do the whole answer thing if there are no answers? If it is really just this mythical, spiritual, Lovecraftian thing, why do this like, oh, here's the logical, the government did, like, why do that?
And I don't think the movie fully satisfies what you're talking about. The movie's not interested in answers.
But don't even tease that, like, oh, see, we actually have a cohesive narrative of what happened, but we're only going to give you like pieces of information that don't actually make sense when you think about it. Just don't even go there. I didn't need that.
To me, that's a failure on the audience and not on the creators. It's
totally a failure of the creator.
They're not interested in providing the answer, and the demand for there being a more logical explanation is not their fault.
But they did that. They could have easily.
They didn't do anything. They just said, "Oh, in the '80s, it was a government experiment gone wrong." That's it. So your need to have more information to make that make sense is not their fault. It doesn't fucking matter. That answer to me is like more of a shrug than anything. It conjures 2 things. It conjures Reagan era bullshit about the homeless, which was part of the Hands Across America thing. And it conjures like the 1980s in general, which has like a horror movie association with like, I don't know, Thriller is in there, and they reference C.H.U.D in the first scene, and like a few other like 80s horror things. So in that 80s government experiment explanation, they're conjuring a mood and an era and then choosing not to explain it any further because it's not that interesting. The more interesting thing is the Tethered's relationship to us and the weird-ass fucking nightmare imagery that comes out of it. And that's what 90% of the movie's about. So if you're going to focus on
and I don't actually think that that's that interesting.
You don't think
either.
the costuming and like
the
from weird
a production
performances
standpoint, Again, the music, the costumes, the cinematography, even the actors do a good job. My whole problem with this is like the plot and the script.
God, who gives a shit?
People that care about, like, if you're presenting to me this vision and this critique and this metaphor, at least have it make some fucking sense.
I do not care about logic.
Well, I know you don't.
It's the least interesting thing about any fucking movie, period.
Yeah, but you need a little bit of that.
And it has plenty.
No, it doesn't. It makes no fucking sense if you think about it for 1 minute and you try to like articulate it. Okay, what actually happened there? I really got no clue, but it was nightmarish and it conjured up very vague metaphors about
what I'm saying is uninteresting is trying to apply a scientific logic to a supernatural scenario. They tapped into something cosmically horrific. They realized they couldn't use it for what they intended it for, and then they abandoned it, and it got weird. That's the whole story.
Again, they didn't go the complete supernatural route, which I would have been perfectly fine with. They tried to like do the rational scientific thing and do the supernatural, and you can't have it both ways.
So you're going to fault the entire movie for a paragraph of dialogue?
Not just a paragraph. Okay, you're trying to present it in a way like, okay, there's some scientific, rational explanation for this world and the dynamics. And then It's like, okay, you're giving me leeway to like, now I have to think about it in that way. Okay, how does this logically work? And you didn't explain any of it, and it makes no sense. And I have no idea what the rules of this universe are.
Just as much sense as Jason not dying and Freddy living in your dreams and every other stupid fucking slasher scenario that doesn't make any goddamn sense. It's just that we've become so much more literal and logical in the way we process story now that we need things to make sense in a logical plane. And I don't agree with that. Like,
typically not that kind of view.
Yeah, and I'm disappointed that you are attacking this movie on like a cinema sins level, or like that doesn't really quite add up, when the whole point of it is more the mood and the imagery and not.
But I would be fine with that if I felt like the metaphor like worked and it was trying to say something beyond just like, yeah, you know, poor people, if they had the opportunities of rich people, they would do well. The only thing it touches on beyond that is like kind of the erasure of history with the, you know, it used to be the Native American funhouse and now it's just the Wizard funhouse. There's little touches like that, but beyond that, I don't think this film successfully says anything.
I think it says that there's no ethical consumption under capitalism.
No, it doesn't. Because
every move you make in the modern world is negatively affecting someone you cannot see in a direct, harmful way. And there's really nothing you can do about it because the situation was set up when you were born. But you are still causing real world harm, and one day, whether morally or cosmically or ethically, it will come back to fucking eat at you. And there will be a violent upheaval.
I don't think the movie successfully said that at all.
I think it says it just as well as Parasite, but in a more interesting way.
I disagree so wholeheartedly.
And I think just as much as Get Out is about like liberal racism, like latent liberal racism, I think this movie is about classism, but in a more interesting way. I would rather it be a little messy and hard to puzzle through and be like, what the fuck? Than like, oh, I see what you did there. That was very clever. Like, I'd rather it be a weird dream than a clever construction. I think that is more cinematic. I think that the language of telling a logical linear story is something you can do in fiction. It's something you can do in even like an epic poem or like a oratory format, like a true crime podcast. You can tell a good story about class and racism. But in cinema, you're going to use the tools of cinema to say something in a cinematic language. The way this movie does a messy, dreamlike assault of like audio and visual just weirdness that is like deeply upsetting but still touches on those same themes. I think this is a more interesting movie to parse through, and I think it's just a better film in like using the medium for what it's good for.
I agree that as a film you're talking about the unique qualities of film, and I do feel like in that sense this is a better made from a technical standpoint film than Get Out. But its message is so jumbled and it's so broad. It's so broad it doesn't really touch on anything in depth. And all you can really say is like, oh, it gave me this vague, nightmarish
No, it gave me a
feeling.
deeply upsetting, nightmarish feeling. It's a different night.
I feel like it's a hot mess. And I still admire it for trying to do a lot, but it just absolutely didn't make any of its intentions clear.
And yet you'll say that it's on the nose in other parts too. It's messy and doesn't say anything, but it's too on the nose at the same time. That's self-contradictory.
Well, on the nose in what?
You said like the "We Are Americans" line was too on the nose, and like the class distinction stuff was like too on the nose.
No, I said the "We Are Americans" line made me cringe, but on reflection, it's like it makes sense because, you know. So I'm able to see how my initial reaction to that line might be wrong, but my initial reaction to this film as a whole didn't change, and it actually deepened more on a second viewing.
Me too, but in the opposite direction. I loved it even more the second time. And I do think that the film you chose to pair with it was good. I think it fits thematically, and I think it was partly inspiration for what Jordan Peele did here. But I think what he did was turn the kind of movie we're about to talk about from the 80s, from like schlock, cheap filmmaking to like high, meticulously like fussed over art. It's a high ambition art film version of a schlocky 80s horror premise, which that confluence of like high art and schlock and like messy storytelling is like my favorite kind of shit.
But it's stuck in this middle ground of like, we want to give the audience some answers so they have some understanding of this tethered world and how it came to being. And I feel like when you do that, and you also try to do the Lovecraftian cosmic horror that you can't understand, you can't really bridge the gap there. Because when you try to make it like give it a logical explanation,
they don't try that hard.
They do. That's what the whole like last third of the film, when they go down there and they're showing.
I'm telling you, it's one conversation in a classroom that lasts like 2 minutes, and to fault the rest of the movie for it is deeply silly.
But that's what the whole film is building up to, Brandon.
Who cares?
That's not who cares. The film itself set itself up. Like, oh, here's the grand reveal. All these kind of movies, like, there's this mystery. How did this world come into being? Either decide I'm not going to address any of these questions, or like explain it in a way that makes sense. And the film tries to have it both ways, and because of that, it fails. And because of that, it's like metaphor is muddled, and it lost me.
And what I'm saying is, this filmmaker who has like a lot of clout and could have done anything after Get Out, because it was a massive success on a small budget, decided to make this deeply weird movie and somehow convinced people to go out and see it in the theater. And that's what I want out of life. I want movies this fucking weird and messy
I'll give you that.
To have this wide of an audience.
We can agree on that.
I don't want every movie to be Star Wars. I want every movie to be Us, where it's weird and messy and maybe doesn't connect with everybody, but it is a deeply ambitious, beautifully crafted nightmare that's just like hard to pinpoint, and I love thinking about it.
I think it's a big mess.
Okay. Maybe that's my favorite genre. I don't know. I love a big mess.
No, but see, like, it's so strange because we've talked about this before. I love movies that are a mess.
Yeah.
I love movies that are over ambitious. I'd rather something that's over ambitious and kind of misses the mark than something that was like had a low mark and hit it, you know. But for some reason, this movie just bugs the shit out of me.
I think you're failing the movie. I don't think it's the other way around. I think you're applying like a very rigid style of like storytelling logic to a movie that is not interested in providing answers to that. Well, and it's just not that kind of movie.
But it is, because
we're disagreeing about one paragraph or like one scene.
That is totally what the whole film is leading up to.
That part's debatable.
And what the audience like is kind of expecting. And anyway.
Well, what did you choose to pair with this film from 1984?
C.H.U.D, which is what, again, there's a reference very early on.
Yeah, in the first scene when she's watching the Hands Across America commercial, there's a VHS copy of C.H.U.D on the shelf next to the screen.
Which there are a lot of parallels with this movie and Parasite and Us too, where, you know, you called it schlocky earlier, and it is.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, it's a very basic story. There's like homeless people have gone missing and they live in the sewers and
below New York City.
Below New York. And it's kind of an intricate plot though, which I think is different for this sort of movie, where you have politicians involved, you have a photographer involved, you have a police captain, you've got like the EPA or whoever involved, like,
and the guy who runs the homeless shelter
played by Daniel Stern, always in a messy shirt for some. But so you have like all these figures kind of playing into this. Ultimately, it's about like these homeless people that get infected with like this toxic waste that the government has been hiding in the sewers, and it creates these cannibalistic
humanoid underground dwellers,
C.H.U.D, where it comes from. And so, again, I thought it linked with the other films we were talking about.
Yeah.
But what I appreciate about this movie is that, yeah, on its surface, it's kind of a Larry Cohen schlocky monster film, but it's actually pretty intelligent. I appreciate it because it doesn't go into the broad humor. Like, it takes itself pretty seriously for a schlocky monster movie. And I think the C.H.U.Ds look pretty gross and gnarly. And
I think the one thing that's great about this movie is the C.H.U.Ds.
Yeah.
They're really cool design. They're like this goopy 80s monster, except they have these giant bug eyes that are like light bulbs. Mm. And it's a really cool design. And when I'm saying schlocky, I guess that is an insult to other people. Like, I mean, obviously I watch a lot of schlock. Like, I love when someone can turn like a $10 budget into a cult classic, which that's what this movie feels like.
But usually those films, like I said, they go for like the broad jokes and they kind of are winking at the camera in a way. This film plays differently than that. It takes it pretty straightforward. There's not like a whole lot of humor in this movie, which might like bug some people that are a fan of these. But I kind of like it had this sort of intricate plot government conspiracy, and it had a lot of character-driven scenes and dialogue, and it like was trying to be something maybe greater than what it actually is.
Yeah,
That's
sense. The thing I most admire about it is that it's trying to scrap together like what appears to be very limited resources. Like it does look like a Larry Cohen or like a Frank Henlotter film, but it's even cheaper than those. And yet, because it has such a great hook in that title, it has a sort of lasting cultural impact. And I really like appreciate someone being able to put together something this cheap that is this long of a reputation. This movie came out in 1984, so that's what, like 35 years ago?
Yeah.
That's impressive that we're still talking about something this limited in its resources.
And that inspired us.
Yeah. Did you know that Jordan Peele dated or was childhood friends with the daughter of this film's director? And used to play with props from the film at their house when he was a kid. Yeah.
That's cool.
So this has a very direct influence on us. I think it's not even like a question. Like it's like a clear line where he took this idea and turned it into something, something much weirder and wider, but because he had a bigger budget. Like they were sort of working with what they had here.
Well, and you only see the CHUDs for like 30 seconds.
That's a problem. I don't like this movie. I've watched it before and I found it boring both then and now.
It is.
Yeah, it's very boring.
It's pretty boring. And you really don't get to the CHUDs.
Last 20 minutes of the movie?
30 maybe. And you don't see them very often. The things I appreciate about it are also kind of its downfall is because it takes itself so seriously. And there's all these there's policy discussions about like, how are we going to deal with the CHUDs? Are we going to gas them out? Oh no, that's not good for the city. And that sort of stuff, man, it just makes it pretty serious affair when maybe it could have been helped by some humor.
I agree, and it reminded me a lot of Larry Cohen, like you said, but in particular, Q the Winged Serpent, which has those same exact boardroom scenes where Daniel Stern and this photographer character, who I don't know who the actor is, he looked pretty boring, but they're both advocating for these homeless people to be paid attention to. And the government is all of a sudden paying attention because a couple rich people went disappearing as well. Those boardroom scenes where they're advocating for them, I'm thinking, man, Michael Moriarty in Q the Winged Serpent was so electric to watch in these same exact boardroom scenes. Like I couldn't take my eyes off of him.
And I feel like that's why they cast Daniel Stern to kind of be, because in Home Alone and stuff, he has that quality.
This is pre-Home Alone.
Yeah. But I feel like he has that quality, and maybe that's why they cast him in the film, but he doesn't bring that same electricness.
He's got nothing going on here. He's like, there's a couple shots where I swear he forgets his lines and stumbles, and they just kept the take. He's barely piecing it together here. And it was a mistake to not make him the main character, too, because even he was at least more memorable than the photographer guy.
John Hurd he's from Home Alone, too.
Was he play the dad or something?
He's the dad in Home Alone.
Yeah, I forgot him in that movie, too. I mean, Catherine O'Hara is the mom. Remember that?
I remember that. Yeah. But yeah, John Hurd, he's the dad
Sure.
in Home Alone. So there is some parallels there.
I don't even remember there being a dad in Home Alone, so I'm just going to have to believe you.
Yeah, I remember in the airport and then in the home and
But even they cast John Goodman as a single scene cop in this film, where he's sort of hitting on a waitress, and there's more personality in that scene than there is in the entirety of the rest of the film. Yeah, so I think if there was a Michael Moriarty type where you just what the fuck is this guy doing? That Nick Cage energy where the performance carries the movie.
Right.
And this could have been a cult classic and still kept the small amount of chud that you get. But as is, the personalities are too boring to support the small snippets of chud.
And Q, the Winged Serpent is a good example where, again, they only show the serpent for seconds at a time.
Right.
Because of the small budget, but again, it works because of the performances. Like I said, this one, while I admire it for being more restrained and trying to be more of a straightforward drama, that's ultimately what makes it kind of boring and a slog to get through. I do think the CHUDs are very cool to look at.
Oh, they're great.
I just wish they were throughout the entire movie, and I did kind of find myself tuning out pretty regularly.
Yeah, me too. Both times I watched it, I remember the first time I watched it, I was hard to stay awake for it.
But what I don't get, I remember, looking up lists of worst movies, and CHUD would be on there, and it's this weird middle area where it's not so bad that it should be on like worst movie of all time list.
No, it's admirable.
It's admirable in that it was trying to take itself seriously, but it's also not good enough and doesn't have good enough performances or memorable performances for me to like care to watch it.
It's not that interesting, ultimately.
Even the social commentary is pretty straightforward.
Well, yeah, like it has one idea, which is that homeless people are disappearing because the government is like dumping nasty shit in their territory and it's mutating them. It doesn't keep shifting that idea in any interesting way. There are some weirder stuff that happens once in the last 20 minutes, once the C.H.U.D come out of the sewers and start attacking people. That's where it starts getting into the Us territory that I really like, where there's just illogical shit that happens and you just sort of like take it at face value. Like the photographer's girlfriend in particular is in this apartment where she's being targeted by the C.H.U.D for no explained reason. And just weird stuff happens in there. Like she's taking a shower and then blood just shoots out of the plumbing.
I love that they just needed an obligatory shower scene.
Right. And to me, that is one of the more interesting parts of the film because it's just so disconnected from any logical explanation. It has nothing to do with the C.H.U.D or the government experiment or anything. It's just her having a shower and then something really fucking weird happens in it. And the movie just sort of moves on as if that was like a thing that happens. And then the C.H.U.D, start breaking down the walls and invading her apartment in this like home invasion scenario that really doesn't make any sense either. It's not like they're doing that throughout the city or that she's of particular interest to them. I mean, I guess the photographer took some of their portraits before they turned into C.H.U.D, but other than that, I mean, they don't really know who she is. Yeah. And yeah, I think that's when the movie starts getting more fun to watch. It's just when weird, unexpected shit starts to happen once the C.H.U.D come to the surface. It's just it delays that for so long that like you sort of give up on it before it gets there.
Agreed. I do think in comparison to Us, it's kind of like the anti-Us in that it has a very specific thing it's trying to say, that governments and rich people don't give a shit about poor people and they'd be willing to poison them and just do away with them if they could. And it totally goes with that thesis and it executes it in a way like you're like, oh, I know what this film was about. Like the rich hate poor people, but it doesn't really do anything interesting with it. Us, for me at least, was on the complete opposite spectrum where it's trying to say kind of the same thing, but also a lot of other things, and also being really like out there and artistic in the way it does it, and yet it falls apart because it doesn't execute what it's trying to say, because I don't know what it's trying to say. So to me, both of them aren't great.
And the way I would put it is, I think the trajectory of C.H.U.D is more of how filmmaking has gone since the 80s. I think now what we have is a lot of over-explanation of intent and meaning and things where you have to justify the weird indulgences. Like all this logical groundwork is laid in films now so that something weird can happen in the third act. And it's like, no, I want the weird shit up front and I want it to get weirder and like more difficult to pinpoint. And that's what Us does, is it starts off with this unfathomable scenario that's difficult to pinpoint. And then it spirals out from there and gets even bigger and odder as it like, moves away from this one family to show this like worldwide event, or at least countrywide event. And then when it gets to a point where it could try to logically explain these things, it's hardened. It doesn't care about that. It was more about the spreading of the chaos. What makes Parasite interesting is it does the C.H.U.D thing that I don't normally care for.
Yes.
Where it lays out all this logical groundwork so that it can get to this place where it can do something very odd in the second or third act, instead of just starting off like balls to the wall crazy.
And I think that's ultimately why I loved Parasite way more than any of the other movies we talked about.
And I think most people are responding to that same thing. Parasite, at least once it gets to the weird part, will go like fully committed into the oddity of the scenario. And before it gets there, it's already having fun while it's laying the logical groundwork. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying I wish more movies were allowed to be illogical out the gate and just get weirder and weirder until they end at their most exponentially ridiculous point, because that is my favorite template for a story in a film. And I don't need things to make sense the way a lot of people do, because I don't think that is the most cinematic quality of cinema. I don't think that logical storytelling is the foremost tool of the medium. I think that there are other things that are more prominent and more unique to the medium that, when executed in a way that resonates with you personally, whether or not Us did is debatable. That's the type of movie I want to see more of. Just movies that use every tool of their medium to full advantage to create something odd and that could not be done in any other template. Even television has been exalted as this like, oh, they're better than movies now. TV shows are like telling better stories and like doing weirder things than movies could ever do. And I think every now and then you'll see something like Us or like Climax or The Wild Boys where you're like, you couldn't make that into a TV show. That is something much weirder and like less willing to be like pinpointed logically. And I think movies can tap into that like dreamlike state.
I'm with you 100%. Like, because I feel like I need to kind of bridge the gap here because, you know, we argued about Us, but I agree that I want filmmakers to take chances, to get weirder, to do things that other mediums can't do. And I don't always like answers. I think when you take chances, audiences can get alienated.
Yeah.
And I think with Us, I finally found like 9 times out of 10, I'm all on board with the weird shit, no answers. And it was a little refreshing to like finally find a weird one where I like couldn't get on board with it. But again, like you're always going to run the risk of alienating audiences.
I mean, just
and that's
how
fine.
cool is it that there's like a Southland Tales Suicide Club style like sprawling mess of a film that a lot of people saw and talked about. Like we don't get that very much. Like that is an increasingly rare indulgence for American film going audiences.
And I love polarizing films too. And I feel like Us was maybe not really polarizing, but kind of had middling reviews.
I think it's a relatively polarizing film considering how many people saw it. Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like I recently, we're doing the top movies of the decade, and I rewatched Mother the other day, and that was a polarizing film. And again, very sprawling, but that, connected with me on a very deep level. So that's the way it goes. You take chances, and sometimes not everyone's gonna get it, and that's fine. But yeah, I would prefer that trajectory in filmmaking than just kind of doing the old point A to point B plot storytelling.
And my example of a movie this year that I did not like that is in that same vein was Under the Silver Lake. It's in that same exact ambitious mess thing that I usually love, and I didn't like it. So I'm not 100% batting average on those either. So I don't know. Maybe next year we'll find another Mother that we can agree on.
Yeah.
Well, next time I talk to you will be our top films of 2019.
Yeah. So got a lot to catch up on.
Us will be in my top 10. Who knows if it'll be in yours? Up in the air.
We'll probably get into it again.
All right. Well, see y'all in a couple weeks where we'll have a guest from the We Love to Watch podcast, a show I've been on a couple times. We'll have Aaron from that show. We'll be talking about psychedelic musicals with me. We're going to be doing the Monkees movie Head, which is a psychedelic masterpiece that I just saw for the first time, and I'm very excited to talk about with him. And then also a couple more psychedelic movies, just, in our usual format, but just with a guest. So Aaron Armstrong from We Love to Watch. If you want to hear their shows, I've been on episodes about Xanadu, which is another musical. I also did the Vincent Price version of The Fly. I feel like I was on a third episode, but I can't remember. Anyway, check out their show. It's great. It's already more popular than ours, so I don't even know why I'm plugging it. But we'll see y'all in a couple of weeks. And then after that, our top movies of the year.
Hey.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.